Gervais' Topographica Hibernica, and in the Gervais of Tilbury's Otia Imperialia, both written for royal audiences. Gervais reveals to the reader the belief in such transformations. He also mentions women turning into cats and into snakes. Was widespread across Europe. He uses the frame "que ita dinoscotna" when discussing these metamorphoses, which translate into "it is known." Gervais, who was writing in Germany, also tells the reader that the transformation of men into wolves cannot be easily dismissed. For in England we have often seen men change into wolves. Vidimus enim frequenta in Anglia per lunetonis homens in lupos mutari. Further evidence of the widespread belief in werewolves and other human-animal transformations can be seen in theological attacks made against such beliefs. Conrad of Hirsau, writing in the 11th century, forbids the reading of stories in which a person's reason is obscured following such a transformation. Conrad specifically refers to the tales of Ovid in his tract. Pseudo-Augustine, writing in the 20th century, follows Augustine of Hippo's argument that no physical transformation can be made by any but God, stating that the body corporeally cannot be changed into the material limbs of any animal. Mary de France's poem Bisclare is another example in which the eponymous nobleman Bisclare, for reasons not described, had transformed into a wolf. Every week, when his treacherous wife stole his clothing needed to restore his human form, he escaped the king wolf's hunt by imploring the king for mercy, and accompanied the king thereafter. His behaviour at court was gentle until his wife and a new husband appeared at court, so much so that his hateful attack on the couple was deemed justly motivated, and the truth was revealed. This lie, a type of Breton sung poem, follows many themes found within other werewolf tales. The removal of clothing and attempting to refrain from the consumption of human flesh can be found in Pliny the Elder, as well as in the second of Gervais of Tilbury's werewolf stories, about a werewolf by the name of Chaucer. Mary also reveals to us the existence of werewolves' belief in Britain and Norman France by telling us the Franco-Norman word for werewolf is garwolf, which she explains are common in that part of France where many men turned into werewolves. Gervais also supports this terminology when he tells us that the French use the term gerolfi to describe what the English call werewolves. Melion and Piclarel are two anonymous lays that share the theme of a werewolf knight being betrayed by his wife. Interesting. The German word werewolf is recorded by Burchard von Worms in the 11th century and Berthold of Regensburg in the 13th, but is not recorded in all of medieval German poetry or fiction. While Baring-Gould argues that references to werewolves were also rare in England, presumably because whatever significance the wolf men of Germanic paganism had carried, the associated beliefs and practices had been successfully repressed after Christianization, or if they persisted, they did so outside of the sphere of literacy available to us. We have sources other than those mentioned above. Such examples of werewolves in Ireland and the British Isles can be found in the work of the 9th century Welsh monk Nennius. Female werewolves appear in the Irish work Tales of the Elders from the 12th century, and Welsh werewolves in the 12th to 13th century Mabinogion. In 1539, Martin Luther used the form Beowulf to describe a hypothetical ruler worse than a tyrant who must be resisted. Interesting. The Germanic pagan traditions associated with wolf men persisted longest in the Scandinavian Viking Age. Harald I of Norway is known to have had a body of Ulfhedna, wolf-coated, which are mentioned in the Vatsnotilla saga, Harald Skovald and Volsunga saga, and resemble some werewolf legends. The Ulfhedna were fighters similar to the berserkers, though they dressed in wolf hides rather than those of bears, and were reputed to channel the spirits of these animals to enhance effectiveness in battle. These warriors were resistant to pain and killed viciously in battle, much like wild animals. Ulfhildna and berserkers are closely associated with the Norse god Odin. The Scandinavian traditions of this period may have spread to Kievan Rus, giving rise to the Slavic werewolf tales. The 11th century Belarusian prince Vleslav of Polotsk was considered to have been a werewolf capable of moving at superhuman speeds, as recounted in the tale of Igor's campaign. Vleslav the prince judged men. As prince he ruled towns, but at night he prowled in the guise of a wolf. From Kiev, prowling, he reached before the cocks crowed to Mutkoran, the path of great sun. As a wolf prowling he crossed. For him in Polotsk they rang for matins early at St. Sophia's the bells, but he heard the ringing in Kiev. The situation, as described during the medieval period, gives rise to the dual form of werewolf folklore in early modern Europe. On one hand, the Germanic werewolf, which becomes associated with the witchcraft panic from around the 1400s, and on the other hand the Slavic werewolf or Vlokolak, which becomes associated with the concept of the revenant or vampire, as you'll probably remember from our vampire series. The Eastern werewolf vampire is found in the folklore of Central and Eastern Europe, including Hungary, Romania and the Balkans, while the Western werewolf sorcerer is found in France, German-speaking Europe and in the Baltic. Now we move to early modern history. There were numerous reports of werewolf attacks and consequent court trials. In the 16th century France, in some cases there was clear evidence against the accused of murder and cannibalism, but none of association with wolves. In other cases, people have been terrified by such creatures, such as that of Gil Zagania in Dole in 1573. There was clear evidence against some wolf, but none against the accused. Werewolvery was a common accusation in witch trials throughout their history, and it is featured even in the Valais witch trials, one of the earliest such trials altogether in the first half of the 15th century. Likewise, in the fall, child-eating werewolves were reported as early as 1448. A peak of attention Caesar by Vorderpasta in 1653, however, argued that lycanthropy was purely an illusion. After this, the only further record from the Vord dates to 1670. It is that of a boy who claimed he and his mother could change themselves into wolves, which was, however, not taken seriously. At the beginning of the 17th century, witchcraft was prosecuted by James I of England, who regarded werewolves as victims of delusion induced by a natural superabundance of melancholic. After 1650, a belief in lycanthropy had mostly disappeared from French-speaking Europe, as evidenced in Diderot's Encyclopedia, which attributes reports of lycanthropy to a disorder of the brain. Although there were continuing reports of extraordinary wolf-like beasts, but not werewolves. One such report concerned the beast of Gévaudan, which terrorized the general area of former province of Gévaudan, now called Lozère, in south-central France from the years 1764 to 1767, and it killed upwards of 80 men, women and children. This story of particular is actually a very famous story, and it's quite interesting, and the reason it's interesting is those 80 deaths, and the historical records around it are actually quite substantial. There definitely was something going around killing people. And so, to expand a little bit more on this story, because it doesn't really hear, they ended up trying to go on a mass wolf hunt and find wolves, and they ended up killing, I think, 2 wolves one year, and then the killing continued in another year. That were like, they weren't supernatural, of course, or anything, but they were record size, really large wolves, at least from what the records say, and it makes sense as to why so many people were dying in wolf attacks. So the main theory is that they were just maybe a group of, for some reason, super large wolves, or maybe perhaps there was 1 or 2 wolves that were genetically different and for some reason more rabid, and were going around killing people in France. If you're interested, I would look up the story for yourself. You can probably just find it by, like, wolf killing people, France, and it'll probably be somewhere there. Yeah, it's quite an interesting and famous story. Anyway, aside from that ramble, let's get back into the Wikipedia. The only part of Europe which showed vigorous interest in werewolves after 1650 was the Holy Roman Empire. At least 9 works of lycanthropy were printed in Germany between 1649 and 1679. In the Austrian and Bavarian Alps, belief in werewolves persisted well into the 18th century. Until the 20th century, wolf attacks on humans were an occasional but still widespread feature of life in Europe. Some scholars have suggested that it was inevitable that wolves, being the most feared predators of Europe, were projected into the folklore of evil shapeshifters. I think that makes sense. This is said to be corroborated by the fact that areas devoid of wolves typically use different kind of predators to fill the niche. Were hyenas in Africa, were tigers in India, were pumas, and were jaguars in South America. Never heard of any of those as official, mythology. So maybe if you're interested in me reading those arduous rites, would voluntarily be able to transform into a humanoid Kurtadam, literally meaning wolfman. Since the wolf was the totemic ancestor animal of the Turkic peoples, they would be respectful of any shaman who was in such a form. Interesting. Now, we move to lycanthropy as a medical condition. And this is a synopsis, as I was saying before, of the larger page called Clinical Lycanthropy. Some modern researchers have tried to explain reports of werewolf behaviour with recognised medical conditions. Dr. Lee Illes of Guy's Hospital in London wrote a paper in 1963 entitled On Porphyria and the Etiology of Werewolves. Interesting. The same argument that was used to explain vampires, in which he argues that historical accounts on werewolves could have in fact been referring to victims of congenital porphyria, stating that the symptoms of photosensitivity, reddish teeth, and psychosis could have been grounds for accusing a sufferer of being a werewolf. This is, however, argued against by Woodward, who points out how mythological werewolves were almost invariably portrayed as resembling true wolves, and that their human forms were rarely physically conspicuous as porphyria victims. Interesting. Again, the author falls for the same fallacy, that they are trying to use modern science to explain the ancient mythology of the animal, but then getting confused between contemporary literature and what's actually mentioned in history. So, that's a lesson for you, I guess, if you are going to try to explain some mythological phenomena across the world with contemporary science. Actually make sure you know the history and don't get confused with contemporary literature, however fascinating contemporary literature can be. Interesting that they made the same mistake. Others have pointed out the possibility of historical werewolves having been sufferers of hypertrichosis, a hereditary condition manifesting itself in excessive hair growth. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you've seen like Ripley's Believe It or Not, or if you've seen Guinness Book of World Records, you'll get a lot of people that have this specific condition where they have hair like everywhere that's quite overgrown, and so maybe you'll know of that specific reference. However, Woodward dismissed the possibility as the rarity of the disease ruled it out from happening on a large scale, as werewolf cases were in medieval Europe. Okay. People suffering from Down syndrome have been suggested by some scholars to have been possible originators of werewolf myths. I wonder why. I wonder where that conception comes from. Woodward suggested rabies as the origin of werewolf beliefs, claiming remarkable similarities between the symptoms of that disease and some of the legends. Again, rabies being probably the most likely phenomena that could explain, but probably not. Woodward focused on the idea that being bitten by a werewolf could result in the victim turning into one, which suggested the idea of a transmittable disease like rabies. A rabid werewolf bites you, you get rabies, you have some of the symptoms. Maybe. However, the idea that lycanthropy could be transmitted in this way is not part of the original myths and legends, and only appears in relatively recent beliefs. Interesting again. Lycanthropy can also be met with as the main content of a delusion. For example, the case of a woman has been reported who, during episodes of acute psychosis complained of becoming 4 different species of animals. Interesting. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Whispering Wikipedia. We have, I believe, depending on how long the rest of the page is, about 1 episode left. Next episode we will be going into folk beliefs about werewolves and modern reception, so I'm sure it's